I'd just like to welcome everybody here to the debate this evening, which is entitled The Message of the Prophet, and the debate is being held between the Christian Union and the Muslim Society in Trinity. This debate this evening will explore the viewpoints of both religions regarding that matter. My name is Naomi Lamont, and I am the fourth year studying law at Trinity, and I will be chairing the event this evening. Just a few housekeeping matters to kick us off. If anybody has mobile phones on them, if you could switch them off so that there's no interruption throughout the debate. And the event is being video recorded and will appear on the internet and as a DVD. This is a public event and is being filmed for use in the public media. Now I'd like to introduce both our speakers this evening. Our first speaker is Sam Green. He has come the whole way from Australia, in Tasmania. In Australia, he works with the Australian Fellowship of Evangelical Students and has been doing so since 1999. He has degrees in chemical engineering and theology. He also is regularly involved in Christian-Muslim discussions. Our second speaker from the Muslim Society is Abdullah Andalusi. Andalusi, apologies. He is an international speaker, thinker, and activist for Islam and Muslim affairs. His work involves explaining and providing Islamic beliefs and the promoting of the Islamic way of life and Islamic solutions for contemporary problems. He is a former Christian of Portuguese descent and has embraced Islam at a young age after a period of study that started when he was 10 years old. He has continued to study Islam in depth ever since and has long experience of working in the Muslim community. In 2009, he also co-founded the public discussion forum, the Muslim Debate Initiative, a forum that promotes dialogue and critical debate between thinkers, academics, politicians, and public speakers of all backgrounds. So that's both our speakers. I'm now going to outline the way the event is going to run. Each speaker will speak for 25 minutes. So it's a presentation for 25 minutes each. When there is a minute left in the presentation, I will hit my hand on the table when there's a minute left to go. When the time is completely up, I'll hit my hand on the table twice. And that signifies the end of discussion, so if you could sit down at that point. Then there's going to be, each speaker will have a 10-minute session to rebut what the other speakers said in their presentation. And again, from that rebuttal, there will be another 5 minutes after that where the speaker rebuts the rebuttal. Don't get too confused, you'll understand as you go along. And at the end of each time, again, it will work. I will signify when there's 1 minute left and when the time is completely over. At the end of all the discussion between the speakers, there will be no questions throughout this period from the floor. There will be a question period at the end from the floor, and the questions will be addressed through myself as the chair, and I will put the questions to the speakers. And I will let you know when the question session will be happening. Okay, so all that left remains to be left is all the very best to both our speakers this evening. And I believe that Sam is going first on behalf of Christian Union. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening, and it's great to be with you this evening, and I'm really enjoying my time here in Ireland. I went for a train trip this morning from Cork to Dublin and thoroughly enjoyed the countryside. I'd like to thank you as an audience for coming this evening and taking seriously the things of God and wanting to work through these issues. And I'd also like to thank Abdullah for coming down to be part of this. And I'd like to thank the Christian and Muslim groups on campus for working together to organise this event. Tonight's question is the message of the prophets. Both Christians and Muslims believe in the prophets. We both believe that God has spoken to us through the prophets and that it's important to listen and to believe to what the prophets say. But we have a very different understanding of what the message of the prophets is, and hence our debate tonight. I'm going to be answering this question by considering three questions. Where do we find the message of the prophets? What is the message of the prophets? And finally, will you listen to the prophets? So that's what I'm going to do tonight. Three questions. Where do we find the message of the prophets? What is the message of the prophets? And will you listen to the prophets? For each of these, I'll present the Christian position and engage with the Islamic view to some degree. Now, I guess what with Abdullah and I tonight, we may be saying things that may be hard for you to listen to, but I think that as Christians and Muslims, we need to be able to listen to each other and listen to what the other person's got to say, because this is how we actually do listen and learn from each other and can engage with each other better. But my goal is ultimately tonight that we will listen to God and what God has to say through his prophets. Well, let's look at my first question. Where do we find the message of the prophets? For Christians and Muslims, we actually answer this question differently. For Christians, we answer it with reference to the Bible. The Bible actually contains many books. It is not just one book. It's a book that is a collection of many books from many different prophets. It has the Torah, the law of Moses, the Psalms of David, the wisdom of Solomon, the books of the prophet Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and there's others. There's the books of the Gospel as recorded by Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and the writings of the apostles of Jesus. The Bible is a collection of the writings of many prophets from Moses to Jesus and his apostles. Now, Christians are convinced that if you want to know the message of the prophets, then you must read them. And this is what we do. We read all of the prophets privately, we read them at our church, in our churches, and we study them in our theological colleges. I'd like to compare this to how I see Islam learning about the message of the prophets, because it's quite different. Whereas with the Bible it has all of the prophets in it, and Christians read all of these prophets, in Islam, the Quran and the Hadith is based on what Muhammad recited and said. And so it's quite a different way of learning about the prophets. And so when Muslims, it would seem, want to know the message of the prophets, they do not read the prophets themselves, but they listen to what Muhammad recited and said in the Quran and Hadith. I'm bringing this up because I've met many Christians who have said to me that they thought that the Quran actually had the Torah and other books in it the way the Bible does. And so I just want Christians to be clear that the Quran only has what Muhammad recited in it. Now, I actually think that the Christian position at this point is better. I think it's better. I think that if you want to learn the message of the prophets, then it's quite reasonable to read all of the prophets. I don't think that the Islamic position of just listening to what Muhammad says about the prophets is the way to go. I think it's much better to actually listen to the prophets themselves. So that's my first point. Where do we find the message of the prophets? And I want to argue that we find the message of the prophets in the Bible, which is a collection of all of the books of the prophets. Well, what is the message of the prophets? When we read the prophets, what do we find? And I want to give this summary tonight, that the message of the prophets is that God has created us in his image to dwell with him and to share in his glory as sons. I'll say that again. The message of the prophets is that God has created us in his image to dwell with him and to share in his glory as sons. I now want to show you this by taking you actually on a bird's eye view through the prophets. Because you see, the prophets just aren't individual books. When we say the Torah, the books of the prophets, the Psalms and the Gospel, they're not unrelated books. They're actually books that fit together. They have one story of how God has dwelt with humanity, and it has a beginning and it works its all the way through to the end. So I want us to start off at the beginning and to work our way through with these prophets now. I want us to think about what we learn about God with Adam and in the Torah, in the creation account that we read there. We see there, and it's at point A of your notes, we see that God created man and woman in his image. So let me read. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female, he created them. And so this is the glory of humanity, that we are made in the image of God, that we bear some of God's attributes, what theologians would call his communicable attributes. And it's not just that we're made in the image of God to share in his glory, but also when God created us, it was so that we would dwell with him. And you see this in point B of your notes. Then the man, that's Adam, and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And so the picture that the Torah gives of the Garden of Eden, God's original purpose in creation, is that God makes us in his image to share in his glory, and God dwells with us. God dwelt with Adam. Now, when Adam ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and rebelled against God, it wasn't just that he was breaking God's law. It was that, but it was more than that. He was actually breaking this relationship that existed between him and God. And so sin is much more than just law breaking. It's actually breaking the relationship you have with God. And the result is that humanity was banished from the presence of God. We see this here at point C and D. So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden. And then we see with Adam's children, Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence." And so this is how the Bible begins. This is how the Torah, the prophets, begin. That God has made us to share in his glory, being made in his image. That we are to dwell with him, to be like our God. But yet, through the sin that we've committed, we've actually broken that relationship, and we are now banished from God. We no longer dwell with him. Now, as we continue through the prophets, we see that God begins his work of restoration. And we see this first of all with Abraham, where God takes the man Abraham and makes him into a great nation. And the nation in particular that the Torah focuses on is the nation of Israel. And it's interesting that when God makes this nation, Israel is actually called the Son of God. Point E. Then you will say to Pharaoh, this is God speaking to Moses, then you will say to Pharaoh, "This is what the Lord says, Israel is my firstborn son." And Israel is to fulfill that image of God. And so you see at point F, "For I am the Lord your God, so you must consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy." And so this is actually a theme all the way through the prophets, that we are to be holy as God is holy. Unfortunately, this didn't make it into the outline, but it'll be on the overhead there. When God made this nation of Israel, he dwelt amongst them. They had a special tent, or a portable tent, or a portable temple. And this temple was where God would dwell amongst his people. So you see there, "They are to make a sanctuary for me, so that I may dwell among them." And so what we find in the story of the prophets is that when God makes the nation of Israel, it is sort of a restoration of Eden. God has gathered his people to live his way in his land, and God will dwell amongst them. But what we find is that it's not as good as Eden. While God is dwelling amongst them, it's not as good as Eden. And so you see at point G in your notes then. "Then Moses said to Aaron, approach the altar and sacrifice your sin offering and your burnt offering. Make atonement for yourselves and the people. Sacrifice the Lord's offering and the people's offering, and make atonement for them, as the Lord commanded." You see, even though God was present amongst the Israelites, even though he dwelt in that temple, and God was dwelling with mankind again through this temple, yet the problem of sin remained. And now, if you wanted to approach God, you had to sacrifice an animal as a payment for your sin. And so much of the Torah has this system of sacrificial animals for the payment of sin. And so God was present with the Israelites. He dwelt with them, but he was also separated from them in that to approach him, blood had to be spilt. Death had to be paid for your sin. Now, as we read through the history of Israel, we see that the nation of Israel turned away from God. Sin had a grip on humanity, that even when God came and dwelt with humanity in the nation of Israel, sin persisted and they blasphemed God's name. And so we see that God brought his judgment upon the Israelites. You see this at point F in your notes. That King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, entered Jerusalem and burned down the Lord's temple. Now, why that's important is that when that temple was burnt down, the dwelling place of God was removed. And when Israel was exiled out of the land to Babylon, it was like Adam being cast out of the garden again. Israel was no longer dwelling with God. Humanity was not dwelling with God. And it actually demonstrates that humans, no matter how well-intentioned, are bound in sin. We might think, yes, the Israelites sinned, but I'm better than the Israelites. But we can be like that as humans, can't we? We like to compare ourselves to others and say, I'm not as sinful as that person. And we compare ourselves and think that we're acceptable to God because we can look down on others. Jesus tells many parables about that and actually condemns that attitude. No, the failure of Israel and the failure of Adam is the failure that we would have done if we were there. We mustn't go thinking that we're better than them. And so the story of the prophets is that God is still not dwelling with his people, that his plans are yet to be fulfilled. And so as we read through the prophets, we read of many prophecies of the future. And I'd like to now read a few prophecies about the Messiah, because the prophets actually say that the future that God has is going to centre around the Messiah. Look at point I in your notes there. Here's one of the famous prophecies about the Messiah. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. That's from the prophet Isaiah, about 700 years before Jesus. In the book of the prophet Daniel, around 600 years before Jesus, we read this at point J. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory and sovereign power. All peoples, nations and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will not be destroyed. So here we see this one called the Son of Man, which is the image of God. So remember, God made us in his image to share in his glory. And here is this prophecy of one, the Son of Man coming, the one who will fulfill the image of God, sharing in God's glory. And he's going to come and receive the kingdom of God. I think one of the most interesting ones for us, certainly which convinced me as a Christian, is what we see at point K here. Because you see, the prophecies that God has for the future are not just that he will send the Messiah. It's not just that the Messiah will be the true image of God and will share in this glory of God. But the Messiah, when he comes, will actually save God's people. And so we read in point K about the servant of the Lord. Who has believed our message? And again, this is from Isaiah around 700 years before Jesus. Who has believed our message? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was laid upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. What an amazing prophecy 700 years before Jesus. Just as in the Torah there was the sacrifice for sin that God had instituted, so here we see that God himself is going to provide the sacrifice for sins. That God himself is going to do something to save us, to deal with the problem of sin so that we can dwell with him again. And we see this in point L here, from the prophet Ezekiel this time, talking about the future of God's kingdom. And it says, and the name of the city from that time on will be, the Lord is there. You see, this is the future in the prophets. The future in the prophets is that God is going to send the Messiah. That God, when he sends the Messiah, that this Messiah will be the one who shares in the glory of God. That this Messiah will be the one who will work a salvation for God's people. That the Messiah will be the one who will make it so that people can dwell with God again. Now again, as we continue to read through the prophets and we come to the gospel this time, we actually see all of these promises come to their fulfilment in Jesus. Because Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the Son of David to whom these promises were made. He is the true image of God. Have a listen to how Jesus talks about himself fulfilling these promises at point M. This is Jesus the night before his crucifixion. And he says to his disciples, while they were eating, Jesus took bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat, this is my body. Then he took the cup, gave thanks and offered it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. You see how Jesus understands his death there. It's going to be like the sacrifices of old, a payment for sin. And through this, we see that God is going to dwell with humanity again. This is one of the famous chapters of the Bible, right near the end. And it's the picture of paradise for Christians, of the kingdom of God. It says, now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. You see, this is the story of the Bible, that God has made us in his image to share in dwelling with him, to share in his glory and to dwell with him. And that God has brought this to its fulfilment through the person of Jesus. And I guess that is the message of the gospel that I'm asking you to believe. This is the message that Christians put forward. Now, I want to interact with Islam at this point because I don't believe that Islam retains the message of the prophets. In the Quran, there is no indication that we are made in the image of God. In fact, Surah 42 verse 11 would seem to deny that. There is no fatherhood of God, no God dwelling with his people. When it talks about Adam in the garden, God is not mentioned to dwell there. When it talks about paradise, God is not there. The picture of paradise, it seems in the Quran, is not God dwelling with his people, but of pleasure, security, luxury, especially for men. We have these pictures there, and you'll see that that's what they're about. Lo, those who keep their duty will be in a place secure, amid gardens and water springs, attired in silk and silk embroidery, facing one another. Even so it will be, and we shall wed them to fair ones with wide, lovely eyes. Perfectly we formed them, perfect, and we made them spotless virgins, chastely amorous, like of age for the companions of the right. Now, I would say as a Christian that I disagree with that understanding of paradise. I do not believe that is the message of the prophets. The message of the prophets is about dwelling with God. It's about sharing in his glory. It's not about being rewarded with virgins in the way that I find described in the Quran. To move on to my last point now, I want to ask you, will you listen to the prophets? Will you listen to the prophets? It's not just an academic thing that we're doing here tonight. I hope that you're a genuine seeker really wanting to know what the message of the prophets is. I know when I speak to Muslims, almost universally, that their typical response when I share the message of the prophets is to say, yes, but the Bible's corrupted, we don't have to listen to it. And there's only one Quran and it's perfectly preserved. And this is actually an integral issue to this debate as we think about what the message of the prophets is. I want to give you a few reasons as to why the Bible is not corrupt. Firstly, the unity of its message. As I've shown you there, the Bible has one unified message across 1,500 years. And so when you look at the key doctrines about being made in the image of God, the fatherhood of God, the Son of God, God dwelling with his people, God accepting a sacrifice for sin, and the idea of the same covenants, we actually have those going all the way through the Bible, all the way through the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms and the Gospel. And that's a testimony that it hasn't been changed. We also have the fact that we have many ancient texts of the Bible which can show us that it hasn't changed over periods of time, because we can go back to the earlier ones and compare them. In fact, in the Chester Beatty Museum here, you have some very old New Testament documents. We read with Bruce Metzger, one of the main scholars in this area. He said, we can have great confidence in the fidelity with which this material, the New Testament, has come down to us, especially when compared to other literary works. Also, the Quran itself is very positive towards the Bible. I may have to come back to that. I think I'm running out of time. At point R in your notes, you can see that there. But Muslims will say to me that the Quran is perfect, that there's only one Quran. And I sort of need to address that, because it's just not the case, and it really gets in the way of Christian-Muslim discussions. If you have a look at the notes, you'll point there at point T there, you'll see that there are two different Muslims from two different regions in the early centuries of Islam, and they're actually arguing over how to recite a verse of the Quran. One said it this way, the other said it a longer way, and you can see it in the notes there. This actually led to the third Islamic leader, Uthman. We read here, Uthman sent to every Muslim province one copy of what he had copied and ordered that all other Quranic materials, whether fragmentary or whole copies, be burnt. And so we see that early in Islam's history, there was a wholesale burning to standardise one text. So you can't just say there was just one. In fact, I've actually just got two different Qurans here, and you can actually just buy these off the internet. And there are many differences between them. There's over 1,000 differences between these two Arabic Qurans. We may look at these a bit later on. So I guess I'm just asking Muslim leaders not to exaggerate about these things, because I actually think it's dangerous to turn people away from the prophets of God. I think it's a dangerous thing to turn people away from the prophets of God. So I want to conclude now. I want to thank you for your patience as you've come on that journey throughout the prophets. And again, I want to summarise what the message of the prophets is. It's that God has created us in his image to dwell with him and to share in his glory as sons, and that he has fulfilled all of this through Jesus. This is the gospel message that Christians proclaim to the world, the message of all the prophets. Thank you very much.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, as-salatu was-salam nabi kareem Muhammad wa ala alihi sayyibin wa sahbihi salihin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh to all my brothers and sisters in faith and brothers and sisters in humanity. That means peace be with you, which is something that Jesus would say. I'd like to thank the organisers behind this interesting event. I'd like to also thank my colleague Mr. Green for attending and giving an interesting lecture to raise a lot of questions, which I think we need to know about, we need to learn about. And I think perhaps if we look at the title, if we consider the title, what is the message of the prophets? Of course, the word is plural, it's not just one prophet, so obviously we're looking at the whole lines of prophets that both Christians and Muslims agree, and Jews agree with, which is a lot of the prophets mentioned in the Pentateuch and the Torah and the Zabur or the Psalms. And we have a lot of this commonality, so we do believe in the same God of Abraham. We do believe in these prophets that were sent by God with revelation to guide mankind and to guide Israel. And I suppose what we want to really investigate is what has been the consistent message of these prophets throughout history. And are we following this kind of consistent message? You know, which is Islam or is or various branches of Christianity? What are we following in regards to these prophets? And are we still maintaining a consistent message with these prophets? I think this is what I want to look at today. Now, in terms of the theology between Islam and Judaism, from the issue of forgiveness, from the issue of the concept of God, the nature of God, and of course a prophet and revelations and so on, the missions of prophets, we have concordance. There is a complete concordance with that. And in Islam and Judaism, we don't really have any difference of opinion amongst ourselves, between ourselves, with regards to our theology. But obviously we know that with the kind of Trinitarian branch of Christianity, there is some difference of opinion between that and Judaism and Islam. And I suppose I would like to kind of look at the texts which, for example, the Jews hold to be a revelation, divine writ, and see perhaps what they see. Because obviously we both agree that the Jews received revelation, and so we can perhaps go to them and look for some kind of common baseline by which we can judge our beliefs. Now, the interesting thing about the Old Testament is the Old Testament has a lot of very colourful language. What I mean by very colourful language, I'm not referring to the above 18 language, but rather it is very expressive. And so expressive that, for example, humans in the Old Testament can be called God, humans can be bowed down to, angels are called God, but the Jews never understood it as literally being God. It's an expression. There's many kind of Semitic expressions which, Semites or people from that culture, when they read these texts, they understand it. But perhaps when Gentiles or non-Semitic people originally encountered these texts, they took it literally, and then this might have led to some possible misinterpretations. Like, for example, the Son of God. We know that Jesus was called the Son of God in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, there's loads of sons of God. And, of course, many people are called the Son of God, and it was viewed by Jews to be a person who is following God, a man of God. In the Quran, for example, it's the same. It's a Semitic book, of course. We see a traveller is called Ibn Sabil, son of the road. It doesn't mean that his father is literally a road. It just means that he's a traveller. And so we see this. So I'm going to try to kind of iron out maybe where these inconsistencies and discrepancies lie, and see if we can come to some kind of common agreement and baseline as to what is the message of the prophets. Now, as it says in the New Testament, God is not the author of confusion. So if we do see confusion, then surely God is not the author of it. So what is the message of the prophets? Well, I would say that the message of the prophets is monotheism, very strong monotheism. So we see this in the Shema, the recitation of the belief for ancient Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. What it literally says is Yahweh is our God and Yahweh is one. Yahweh was considered the personal name for God, the God of Abraham. So Yahweh is our God and Yahweh is one. Now, it's very interesting because surely, isn't it not sufficient just to say there is only one God, Yahweh? Why do they say Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one? Why is that? We see many polytheistic religions, they would agree that they believe in one God, but God has many different, like for example, let's say take Hinduism, they believe in Brahman who's God, and they has many different, you could say sub-gods or sub-personalities or sub-entities, and so kind of God is many, God is a plurality. Whereas a monotheistic religion, God is only one. So he's not a plurality within himself, like Hinduism or other polytheistic religions. But God actually is one. And even the ancient Greeks believed, Platonic philosophers believed that there is a kind of a first cause or a first mover. But there are kind of pleroma, which is sub-gods, which are each dedicated to a particular thing, like you have a logos and you have many other types of sub-gods, which would be dedicated to organizing part of the universe in a certain manner or certain way. Now, we see that, again, in the Old Testament, this is a very, very consistent and oft-repeated thing. So we see in Deuteronomy, it says, acknowledge and take to heart this day that the Lord is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. Again, in Isaiah, we see, but you are our Father, though Abraham does not know us or Israel acknowledge us, you, O Yahweh, are our Father, our Redeemer, from old is your name. This is in book in Isaiah. And we also see, again, in Nehemiah, you alone are the Lord, Yahweh. You made the heavens, even the highest heavens, and all the starry host, the earth, and all that is on it, the seas, and all that is in them. You give life to everything, and the multitudes of heaven worship you. Now, it's very interesting. Yahweh is identified as a father. And the Jews always, a lot of Jews commonly call God their father. And throughout the Old Testament, you see this connection with Yahweh, Father, Father, Yahweh. Not literally, not in the literal sense, of course. Obviously, it's not the literal father. But we never see anything such as the son of God is Yahweh. We never see that in the Old Testament, ever. If you told this to a Jew, he'd be surprised. Like, I've never heard this before in the Old Testament. I mean, obviously, a Jew living today probably would have heard it before from perhaps missionaries, but back then they would have no concept of Yahweh is the Son or a Son of God, or is the God the Son. Does not occur anywhere in the Old Testament. The concept, I suppose, of the Trinity, which is a much more later doctrine, which came to explain a preconceived notion that Jesus, who is God the Son, and the Holy Spirit is also another aspect of God, and that they're basically three in one, does not occur anywhere in the Old Testament. It is a very new doctrine. There is no message of the Trinity in the Old Testament, which should give us pause for thought. I mean, if this is so important to believe in, if people will be condemned to hell for rejecting the Trinity, and this is part of God's nature, why are the Jews completely unaware of it? For 6,000 years, or however long the duration of their revelation was, they are unaware of something called the Trinity. I think it should give us pause for thought. We see that in the Bible, God does not die. He is considered to be deathless. So we see in Genesis, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called upon the name of the Lord, the eternal God. The eternal God, the God doesn't die, God doesn't change. I mean, this is reiterated in the New Testament, where it says that God is He alone who has deathlessness or immortality. The actual literal meaning is deathlessness, that God basically is not subject, death will never approach him, he's deathless. But we see... this is understood by Jews, that God doesn't die. But we see that Jesus, according to the New Testament, did die. And is that then the qualification for God? So can God actually die? So can the immortal, undying God who is deathless die or go through death? Yeah, sure, he comes back afterwards. Okay, sure, we all come back afterwards. We'll get reincarnated into bodies and brought to a day of judgment. Yeah, of course, we will do that. And our spirit doesn't die, it always lives on. Of course, yeah, but... God is not us. God doesn't even go through the death. He is deathless. So if a man or anyone dies, then can that be God? This is not, you might say, well, this might be a cheap argument. Maybe, perhaps God can die or in a human incarnate form. But then this would refute God's own argument in the Old Testament. For God in Ezekiel 28, says to a very arrogant man who believes himself to be God. He says, "You are a man and not God. Though you set your heart as the heart of a god, behold, you are wiser than Daniel. There is no secret that can be hidden from you." So he's saying that this person, are you all-knowing? Obviously, this person isn't. Will you still say before me? Will you still say this before him who slays you? I am a god, but you shall be a man and not a god in the hand of him who slays you. So basically, God's argument to this arrogant man is, who he's going to send someone to kill this man, said, will you still say you're God when you're about to be killed? Not that when you're dead, will you and you discover you can't bring yourself back to life again, will you still say? No. It says that in front of the person who will slay you, will you still then say you're God? This is God's argument. If you can say that God can die, then you're actually refuting God's argument to an arrogant man in the Old Testament. But God seems to think in the Old Testament that's a very good argument. And of course, the also argument against this arrogant man was that he's ignorant as well. Obviously, God is not ignorant. There's nothing that God doesn't know. But we see again in the New Testament that it says, "No one knows the last day, nor the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." So the Son does not know. There's something he does not know. The last day. Can God not know something? Is God ignorant? Is there something that God is not aware of? No. The Father knows, of course. And we know in the Old Testament the Father is Yahweh, but not the Son. And we see, again, in the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, that God is not a man. So it says, God is not a man that he should lie, neither the Son of Man that he should repent. And this is very interesting. So God is making a statement, again in Hosea, "For I am God and not a man." So God is telling us so many times he is not a man, he's not the Son of Man. But then would he later on come as a man and call himself the Son of Man? Is God the author of confusion? This is not the message that the Old Testament Jews would understand. Again, we see in the Old Testament, nothing can contain God. So in 2 Chronicles, it says, "But will God really dwell on earth with men? The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built." So here's the Old Testament saying that nothing can contain God. But in some people's theologies, a human body can contain God and walk around, and the earth can contain God. A cross can contain God, can bear God on it. But this is refuting the Old Testament. The Old Testament, which is obviously God-inspired, obviously according to the Jews and, of course, Christians, says that nothing can contain God. The earth and all the heavens can contain God, but then people say later on, well, yes, a human body can contain God, and a cross can contain God. It doesn't add up. We also say that no one has ever seen God. This is, I'm going to quote New Testament here, so I'm cheating a little bit. No one has ever seen God, but the only begotten Son who is at the Father's side has made him known. This is in John 1:18. No one has seen God. You can't see God, but we see Jesus. So does that mean that Jesus is God? Obviously not. But it's very interesting. This text is subject to biblical variation. In the Alexandrian text, they change it to the only begotten God, I believe, or rather than the only begotten Son, they say the only begotten God. They try to change it to infer that Jesus is God. Yet all the early church fathers, all the other traditions from both Byzantine and Europe don't have that version in it. But just from Alexandria, which is in Egypt, they changed this version to make Jesus sound like he's the only begotten God, which doesn't make, is God begotten, or is a different question. But we see there's textual corruption, which has theological implications. But most scholars don't accept that, because every other tradition, including all the church fathers, cite the tradition that no one has ever seen God, but the only begotten Son, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. So this is where perhaps biblical textual issues have kind of changed or interfered with doctrine. We see in the Old Testament, God does not change. So in the book of Malachi, God is saying, I, the Lord, do not change. But according to obviously Christian beliefs, God adopts a human nature. He adds to himself a human nature and comes into the world. The word becomes flesh, according to John. The word becomes flesh. It's this change. But Malachi says God doesn't change. So how would we understand this? Does it mean that the Word or Jesus or whoever is a God? It can't be. Otherwise you're refuting the Old Testament or the Torah. Again in Isaiah it says, to whom will you compare me? Who is my equal? So there's nothing you can compare to God. There's nothing that actually is equal to God. And it's very interesting, this phrase, because who's saying it? Is it the Father who's saying it? Is it God the Son? If it's the Father who's saying it, then and he's saying that nothing is equal to him, yet we understand that the Trinity concept, at least according to the Western conception of it, is that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are co-equal. Yet, who is saying this? If it's the Son is saying it, then the Son is more equal, is higher than the Father and the Holy Spirit. If the Father is saying it, then the Father is higher than the Son or the Holy Spirit. It's very difficult to get out that. What about, this is the concept of God. We see, obviously, all these ideas have no problem with the Islamic conception of God. We agree 100%. In fact, these verses could have been from the Quran. We see also, what about original sin? No doctrine of original sin in the Old Testament. Jews do not have a conception of original sin. We see in Deuteronomy, it says, the father shall not be put to death for the children, neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. And again, this is reiterated in Ezekiel 18:20. So there is no original sin. You don't bear the sins of anyone else. But according to a lot of Christian doctrines, maybe not all of them, but most Christian sects, they do believe in original sin. What about forgiveness? Repentance and forgiveness. Yes, the Jews have a sacrificial system for committing sins, but if you read Leviticus, it actually says for unintentional sins. What's the blood sacrifice for committing fornication? What animal must you sacrifice if you want to repent or atone for committing fornication, sex outside marriage? There is none. There is none. I'm not talking about adultery, because people say adultery, well, you kill the person. Okay, all right, but what about fornication? There is no sacrifice. You don't have to, what ram or cow you have to sacrifice for fornication. It's for unintentional sins. Expiation. In Islam, we also have expiations for unintentional sins or breaking certain obligations where you didn't intend to. So in this situation, Islam and Judaism are in concordance. But how do Jews get forgiven then? Well, we see. Is it always blood? Well, firstly, even in unintentional sin, if you're too poor to afford a sheep or a ram, you can give basically, I think, barley or wheat or something like this, flour and so on. Where's the blood in flour? There isn't. So it's not about the blood, it's about basically giving something which is of wealth to atone or expiate your sin. We also read in 2 Chronicles a very Islamic conception of forgiveness, which is God is saying, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from the heaven and I will forgive their sin and heal the land. And again in Isaiah it says, I have swept away your offences like a cloud, your sins like the morning mist. Return to me, for I have redeemed you. And even with the issue of Cain, which my colleague quoted, we read in Genesis 4, 6 to 7, then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. So the door of repentance is open to Cain. Repentance and being forgiven for your sin is the teaching of the Old Testament. And Jews believe that if you turn to God with sincere repentance, like Chronicles, the 2 Chronicles, which is a book in the Old Testament, has said, then you will be forgiven. This is an Islamic conception. But the demand that you must always have blood for every sin you do, if this is the case, then God is not forgiving. Then God does not have mercy, because mercy is when you give less, when you don't give the punishment. But if you said, I must demand some blood must be paid, must have my pound of flesh, then how can God forgive? I can forgive someone who sinned against me with no requirement from them. Am I better than God, that I can forgive, but God cannot? No. There's obviously the belief that a Messiah will die and whose blood will bring salvation, again, is not in the Old Testament. The Jews never expected the Messiah to die. They expected the Messiah to be successful and will basically, he will lead Zion, lead Israel and the world and so on. And this is where a lot of the prophecies come from in the Old Testament. But no one believed that the Messiah will actually die. And when even one of some of Jesus' companions, when they encountered, when they heard that Jesus died, and they were shocked by this, they couldn't believe it. But if everyone knew the Messiah would die, then why be shocked? So the Jews never expected the Messiah would die. They expected him to be actually successful. So we see in these situations, these things, that there's a consistent message in the Old Testament, and I would even argue that Jesus' original teachings is again consistent with the Old Testament. But I believe perhaps for historical reasons, this kind of Judaism being encountered by the Greeks, by the Gentiles, and the Gentiles not being able to understand between this colourful language being used in Semitic languages. A lot of things are taken literally. A lot of Greek concepts were taken on board, like the Logos. You actually have Jesus being called the Logos. This is actually a Greek philosophical term used by pagan Greeks, like the Stoics and Platonics. And it basically talked about how God is so distant from the universe, he has to make an intermediary to order the universe he creates, which is identical to the Gospel of John's prologue. What a coincidence. But so this is now, I said, I don't mean to kind of be offensive to anyone who holds these kind of beliefs seriously. I was a Christian myself, but I think it is my duty to kind of tell you what I went through and what I encountered and what opened my eyes up about Christianity, and going back to the teaching of Jesus, because I love Jesus. I affirm he's the Messiah. I affirm that he's a great man. It would be my greatest honor and pleasure on the day of judgment and the afterlife to meet Jesus. And I look forward to that, inshallah. But this is not a criticism of Jesus, any of my discussions, because I love Jesus. We love Jesus. We believe in Jesus. But we don't believe that he's God. And we don't believe that he's part of the Trinity. And we don't believe that he is some kind of sacrificial lamb, because the Jews never had this concept. The Paschal lamb, which is, I think once a year, basically, the Jews would put all their sins on this one lamb. And it would be basically for the atonement for Israel. What people don't realize is, what did they do with this lamb? Did they kill it? No, they just let it go. That's why we've got the scapegoat. Scapegoat, the concept. It's actually a goat, sorry. That's where the concept of goat, the scapegoat came from, it comes from that. There was no killing involved, no blood sacrifice, and that was for the atonement for sins. So blood sacrifice is not always required. As for the issue of, I think it was briefly mentioned about the Quranic textual integrity. Firstly, the Bible and the Quran are two different books. the Bible is a collection of writings by people who were writing about maybe Jesus or before Jesus they were writing about the prophets. Go to your local bookshop, any bookshop, and find a book on the life of Jesus, just written by a normal contemporary scholar. Life of Jesus. If you went back 1,900 years with this book might be a contender to be in the Gospel. That's what the Gospels were. They were just people's written accounts. They weren't actually Jesus writing it or Jesus dictating it, or even, we certainly can't prove his disciples wrote it. And even in these books, they say, we see, I think, was it Luke or Mark, please correct me, which said, it seems a good idea to me to actually write down the account of the life of Jesus. So the person who's writing it, and in a lot of these cases, they say, we found eyewitnesses, we spoke to eyewitnesses about this, or we tried to find eyewitnesses on this matter. So these people didn't see it, they weren't there. There's a lot of questions. They weren't the only Gospels that were written, and not all the Gospels were exegeted into the Bible, and this is something which is different from the Quran. As to textual variations or differences, I can say this in my rebuttal, but there is a lot of variations within the Bible which are theologically important, like I mentioned regarding the only begotten God or the only begotten Son change in the Alexandrian text. As for the issue of the Quran, because you're not familiar with it, some of these arguments, which you might have heard from my colleague, might seem to be textual variants. They're not. The Prophet Muhammad, in his lifetime, there was two companions who argued over their own different recitations. They were ways of reciting the Quran. Now, obviously, how you recite the Quran sometimes can change the meaning of it, but generally speaking, there was, these are different recitations, not different text, or you have chapters missing, or things that weren't part of it, like you have in the Bible. Is not the case at all. When both these companions went to the Prophet Muhammad to resolve their dispute, the Prophet said, I revealed both these recitations to both of you. And this was because in Arabia there was basically roughly about 7 dialects, different Arabic dialects. Arabic wasn't a standardized language, and the Quran was revealed in these different dialects. And they might have different spelling conventions, different grammatical conventions, each of these different dialects. And so to say that these are different versions of the Quran is incorrect when we still have these variations there, and they're all part of the Quran, and they were intended and revealed by the Prophet Muhammad himself. So this is basically not something which is corrupt at all. And just to kind of cite the Cambridge Companion to the Quran, we see Angelica Neuwirth, who is a chair of Arabic Studies at Freien University of Berlin, said, even in regards to this kind of new, kind of old papers and pamphlet sets that they discovered, here's what it said: new findings of Quranic fragments, moreover, can be adduced to affirm, rather than call into question, the traditional picture of the Quran as an early fixed text composed of the surahs we have. So this is a secular institution in the Cambridge Companion to the Quran, affirming that the Quran is pretty much preserved, and the new discoveries are confirming this. So don't let the issues of different recitations confuse you in the matter. And also please remember what I've said today about the consistent message of the Old Testament, and compare it to what you know about Christianity and what you know about Islam, and which one do you feel is continuing that tradition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Abdullah, and I would just like to pick up on a few of the points that you've raised there. Again, I just want to point out the difference that we have when we come to learn the message of the prophets between Christians and Muslims, in that for Christians we read all of those prophets in our churches. We read the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, the Gospel. They're part of our church service. And Abdullah was quoting these tonight, but he was really quoting them in order to prove his point. It's not part of normal Islamic worship to be consulting these prophets to learn of God. I want to pick up on the point that he made, that Judaism, and with its view of monotheism from Deuteronomy 6:4, about "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," is basically Islam. I want to say that's completely wrong. It's completely wrong. And I showed on the table up here. Where are we now? It's a bit further down. It's in your notes. You see the table in your notes about the ideas in the Bible, because you see the one God in the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms and the Gospel made us in his image. And that's all the way through it. Now, the doctrine of the image of God that Islam doesn't have is incredibly important, because it means that God can share his attributes and maintain his unity. Right? That's what the doctrine of the image of God means. This is the Jewish doctrine. It's the doctrine of all the prophets, that God can share his attributes and maintain his unity, that God can dwell with his people. So you see, it is certainly true that Christians, Jews, Muslims, Aristotle all believe in one God, but we believe very different things about them. And I would contend that the Islamic concept of God is far closer to Aristotle with its undivided singularity, almost isolated singularity, compared to what we find in the Jewish scriptures, in the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms and the Gospel, where universally God makes us in his image. He shares his attributes and maintains his unity because he's able to actually share his attributes. And so we find this God sharing his attributes and being the one God at the same time. That is a completely different concept of the one God that we find in Islam. And this is actually the basis of the Trinity, that God can share his attributes and maintain his unity. The doctrine of the image of God is firmly grounded in the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms and the Gospel through this doctrine of the image of God. It's also firmly grounded in that the persons of the Trinity, the revelation of the Trinity, of the Father, Son and Spirit, is not a Christian idea. As I pointed out to you, Israel is the Son of God, God is the Father, and he moves amongst them by his Spirit. When we look at the covenant that God makes with David, in 2 Samuel 7, we see that God says that he will be the father to the Messiah, and the Messiah will be the Spirit-filled Son. And as I pointed out with the prophecies about the coming Messiah, this Messiah will be the Son of David. He will be the Son of God who comes. And again, if you read in the book of Isaiah, you'll see he's the Spirit-filled Son. And so the book of Isaiah, 700 years before Jesus, its future is that God the Father will send the Spirit-filled Son. So I would say that Islam doesn't have anything to do, or has very little to do, with the prophets of the Torah, the God of the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms and the Gospel, and that it is much closer to Aristotelian thought, because the Torah, prophets, Psalms and Gospel all teach that God made us in his image. He can share his attributes and maintain his unity, that he dwells with his people, that there is this central covenantal relationship of Father, Son and Spirit all the way through these books that we see coming to its fulfilment in Jesus. Now, he spoke about God changing when he dies, and how can God die like this? And he quoted some references. I would say that God does not change. I would agree with that. But the reason I would say that is, first of all, it's his plan when he creates the world that he will enter into it. So God is not changing when he enters into our world, because that was his plan, to enter into our world. It's not a change, it's just part of his working in our world. Secondly, it's not a change because, as I said, this doctrine of the image of God is absolutely fundamental to the difference between Christians and Muslims. Because God's made us in his image to bear his attributes, he can come down amongst us because he's actually built creation that way. When God dies, when God the Son enters into our world, takes on human flesh, this is God sharing in our human experience. This is God humbling himself. And in one sense, I want to say, yes, it is strange. It is unbelievable that God would do that. God does not just sit up in the high and mighty demanding worship. God actually, in his love, comes down amongst us. And that is amazing. And this is the love of God that we see in the prophets. You spoke about Jews having the same concept of sin and the forgiveness of sin as Muslims. And you mentioned that the sin offerings were for unintentional sins. But actually that's just not the case. If you read Leviticus chapter 6, which is talking about these guilt offerings, it says, "The Lord said to Moses, if anyone sins and is unfaithful to the Lord by deceiving his neighbour about something entrusted to him, or left in his care, or stolen, or if he cheats him, or if he finds his property and lies about it, or if he swears falsely, or if he commits any such sins that people may do." So I'm afraid you're just wrong in the way you've quoted the Bible there. You're wrong in the way you quoted the Torah, because it's not unintentional sins. very clear that it's talking about all the deliberate sins as well. It certainly does mention the unintentional, but it mentions the intentional explicitly in those verses. And so the Jewish concept, it may well be that in modern Judaism they have the concept of repentance and faith, but that's because they don't have a temple to offer their sacrifices. But the way that the Torah is meant to operate is that there are these sacrifices that I pointed out. You also mentioned that on the Day of Atonement, the lamb, the lamb was not killed. But again, you're not correct there, because there are actually two lambs on the Day of Atonement, which you can read about. And on one of them, it is a sin offering. It's a sin offering, and it is killed. And it represents the judgment of God and death being laid on that lamb. The other lamb, you are correct, is released into the desert, where it most likely dies, but it's released into the desert, symbolising the carrying of sins far away. So it's just not true to say that the lamb wasn't killed, because one wasn't, the other one was. There were actually two lambs on that day. I'd like to briefly look now at the Gospels. You're saying that they're not eyewitnesses. Well, they explicitly say that they were eyewitnesses on several occasions. Let me just read to you in 1 John how the apostle there speaks about his experience of Jesus. Let me just get this quickly here. 1 John. He's speaking of Jesus, and he says, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched." So he's talking about his experience of Jesus. He's saying, I saw Jesus, I heard Jesus, I touched Jesus. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. The New Testament writers are clear that they saw Jesus, that they are giving testimony to him. And in fact, the New Testament has multiple sources telling about Jesus. It's not just the testimony of one man, but there are many apostles all giving their testimony to Jesus. It is certainly true that Luke consulted these people in writing up his account, but certainly the apostles in the other books and as they explained there are the eyewitnesses. You mentioned that the variants in the Quran aren't significant or whatever, but I ask you to have a look at the quote that I gave you there in the notes about the two different Muslims reciting. You'll see it's actually quite theologically different. The first one there says by the night and the day, and the second one says by him who created the night and the day. The first one is animistic, the second one is monotheistic. There's quite a significant difference there. You can actually see a development. And there certainly were extra surahs of the Quran that were considered, surahs 115 and 116, but which weren't included. So I think the textual variants of the Quran are more significant, and we can maybe look at those later on. Thank you.
Okay, not to get through. I'll do it in reverse order. Okay, I said the two recitations of by the night and the day, or by him who created the night and the day. Firstly, they're not theologically significant because in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swears by the moon and by the sun in many other verses. So God himself can swear by things, and then he can also refer to himself. As I said, the recitations are kind of two different kind of referring to two different Arabic dialects. In the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they were both accepted. All seven were accepted, and some people say there's a bit more. So these recitations are all part of the Quran. There were people who were bickering over which recitation was correct during the Prophet's life, and the Prophet corrected this by saying, you're both right, because I told you both these different recitations, and this is the nature of Arabic language from at a time when Arabic wasn't a standardized language. Ibn Mas'ud never ever said that the Uthmanic text was corrupted or was not the Quran. And I would challenge him to bring a quote by Ibn Mas'ud that there was surahs missing or surahs not included. As for the issue of Gospels, and he quoted 1 John. 1 John is not really a Gospel. There are the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. And I don't think 1 John, the letter of 1 John was really kind of clear about what he actually saw of Jesus, and didn't actually think he actually mentioned that he actually met Jesus or saw him or spoke to him. And the gospel writers certainly didn't say that they were there. Didn't say, and I saw Jesus doing this. None of that. It's always written in a narrative style, like they've heard it from someone else, and that's because they did. As for the scapegoat, I made a correction. I said not sacrificial lamb, I said scapegoat, hence the term goat, a scapegoat. And the scapegoat, which was part of the mechanism to atone for the nation of Israel, was not killed or executed. But we're told that blood is required for the atonement of sins, yet this goat is released. So that itself, is showing that there are other kinds of means of atonement that does not require the shedding of blood. That was my only point. I'm not saying that Jews didn't have a sacrificial system. They did. I'm also, when I mentioned about in Leviticus, and I was quoting Leviticus when they said that, these are the rules for unintentional sin. Yeah, sure, there are expiations for small sins, but what is the expiation for fornication? We know that people commit fornication in the Old Testament, and God forgave them. But what was the blood sacrifice required to expiate fornication? There is none. Just repentance. That's my thing. What is the blood sacrifice for fornication? Other points. Okay, he mentioned that God doesn't change. He just basically when he dies or something, he just basically comes down and becomes flesh. That's God changing. If God becomes flesh, that's change. And that refutes Malachi. And you know what? If I had a choice between Malachi, which we all agree is obviously from a source that is Revelation, or from some later theologians who came about and said, yes, well, God can become flesh, and this is very similar to pagan Greek concepts, I would take the Old Testament over that. So I believe God does not enter our world when the Old Testament itself says, what can contain God? I suppose God maybe was confused, because if he realized he could actually enter this world, and then he said, what can contain God? He's actually refuting himself. Again, God is not author of confusion. Humans are, and nothing can contain God. He said that God humbling himself. Oh, how great that is! God humbles himself. God humbling himself. This is the same God who called himself Lord Jealous. I'm a jealous God in the Old Testament, saying that he humbles himself. Doesn't seem to be consistent. Again, there's confusion there. As for what he said about there's no dwelling with God in the Quran, there's no kind of dwelling with God. In the Old Testament, God doesn't physically dwell with the Jews. No Jew understood that God physically dwells with you. They understood that basically, in the metaphorical sense, he's with you, God is with you. Even in the Quran, it says, nothing can contain a God except, the heart of a believer. We don't believe that he literally is contained in your heart. We don't believe that. It's a kind of metaphorical saying. Like in the Old Testament, there are many, many metaphorical sayings in the Old Testament. The Jews approach that the same way we approach the Quran, and we do have this kind of, kind of dwelling with God, but not in literal sense. This is the problem. We're taking things literally and is picking and choosing. The issue is that in the Quran it says, God is not made in our image. Well, why don't you ask a Jew what that means when it says, God made man in his image? There are other verses in the Old Testament which basically explain this, and it says that we have an understanding of good and bad. This is the image. This is just like being the image of God. Even St. Augustine, who's an early church father, many early church fathers talked about the image of God, that God has wisdom and we have wisdom. This is like in the image of God. Never talked about it like literally we are the actual image of God. Not really the case at all. And it just becomes absurd. So the image of God. So what race is God? Is he white? Is he black? Is it which? It doesn't make any sense. God actually is a human. He has two eyes. Why does he have two eyes for? Why don't you just have one eye? How many eyes do you need to lead to see? It just becomes absurd now that God actually becomes a physical creature, and we fall into paganism. We have to watch out for that. And again, God says, "To whom will you compare me?" And according to him, us. So God says, "To whom will you compare me?" And we can just respond, "Well, you compare us." Right? So again, you're refuting the Old Testament here, and I don't think that I will take the Old Testament over your argument, so please forgive me for that. What about in the Old Testament? It said that God can send a spirit-filled son. God sends spirits to people all the time in the Old Testament. Even the Book of Kings, God will send a lying spirit to mislead someone, a lying spirit into them. And we see angels and many humans being given the spirit. And what it means in the Old Testament is not some kind of ghostly thing. It can mean many things. It could be a mentality. It could be an inspiration. This is what the spirit means in the Old Testament. Jews understand this like this. In Islam, we have the same kind of conception as well. There is a concordance. But to say there's literally a spirit of God is coming and so on is silly because it just wouldn't make sense. And Jews wouldn't accept that from you. Now, he mentioned in his presentation prophecies of Jesus in the Old Testament. So he says, the child of Isaiah, for unto us a child is born. What do the Jews understand it? Read the chapter. It's actually referring to, probably the prophecy of Hezekiah, the son of King Ahaz. The chapter even begins with King Ahaz. And this was not something that was going to happen in the future. It is in the present tense. And as I said, in the Old Testament, there's always grandiose titles. All these kings and pharaohs had grandiose titles. And this was one of the grandiose titles for Hezekiah. Now, you might say, well, how do we know this? I mean, how do you know it can't apply to Jesus? Well, was Jesus called the Everlasting Father? Because that's what it says here. It says he should be called the Everlasting Father. So is Jesus called the Everlasting Father? No. So then how can it be him? It can't be. What about Isaiah 50, the suffering servant, and that which is brought up quite a lot? That brings up more problems than it solves. Because if we look at Isaiah, throughout Isaiah, there's only one reference, there's only one being or thing which is referred to as God's servant, and that is Israel. Throughout all of Isaiah, Israel is God's servant. And the Jews and a lot of perhaps Christian scholars understand this to refer to Israel as God's servant. Israel suffers for the sins of its people because they brought the iniquities upon themselves. And you can go read this throughout Isaiah in Isaiah 41:8, 49:3, and so on. So there's actually quite a lot of references. But if you read it, if you actually read that as well, we find this line in it. It says, he will see his seed and he will see his offspring and prolong his days. So basically, he will see his offspring and God will prolong his days. Does Jesus have offspring? Is the Da Vinci Code right? Sorry, this is not referring to Jesus, unless Jesus has offspring. And it's not spiritual offspring. The actual term used, it actually refers to seed, and it's only used in the Old Testament to refer to actual seed, whereas there's a different word used in terms of spiritual sons. See Deuteronomy 14:1, you'll see it there. So it can't be that. And in that it says, therefore I will divide a portion to him with the great, and he shall divide the spoils with the mighty. So basically, he believes that Jesus was given the heavens and the earth, but in this, as to have as authority over. Whereas in this verse, in this verse in the Old Testament, Jesus is dividing his spoils with the mighty. Wouldn't make sense according to his theology anyway. But it makes sense according to Hezekiah, a son of King Ahaz. So that can't be a prophecy of Jesus. I will save my contentions about the Trinity to a bit later, but I think basically we have to look at the inconsistencies that arise when we try to read Jesus into the Old Testament. These prophecies don't fit Jesus, and there's many prophecies or references to either defeats or suffering or victory in the Old Testament. And you could say, yeah, that all refers to Jesus, even though Jesus hasn't actually demonstrated any victory over physical nations. And just say, yeah, well, he'll come in the future and he'll do it, is not actually a proof. Because I could always say, yeah, well, sure, he'll come and do X, Y, and Z. But it doesn't mean that he's actually done it to demonstrate to you some proof that he actually did it. So these are the kind of problems that we encounter when we actually read Jesus into the Old Testament, where the Jews clearly haven't. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Abdullah. Now I'll work through some of those points you have there. If you can turn to point V on your notes. Point V on your notes. Abdullah said that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud did not reject the Uthman Quran. I've actually given you a reference where he did, and there's a whole series of them. I've given you 3 there. So Abdullah ibn Mas'ud reported that he said to his companions to conceal their copies of the Quran. And it's referring to their response to when Uthman ordered that the Qurans be burnt and destroyed. And in fact, in Ibn Sa'd, Volume 2, page 144, it actually records Abdullah ibn Mas'ud preaching against the Uthmanic text. Now, it was also mentioned that he quoted a scholar who said that the modern manuscripts that we're finding are confirming the the Quran. Well, here's one of these from the Sana manuscripts, and you'll sort of notice there that you can see a second script behind it. And what we're finding is that that's actually not the case, that we've actually been able to find some of these pre-Uthmatic texts. And you see at point X in your notes there, the main significance of the Sana Stanford 07 manuscript is that the lower text does not belong to the Uthmatic text tradition. And so scholars are actually starting to find these, and there are a whole range of much larger textual variants. Now, I need to get going, so I've only got 5 minutes. Abdullah was saying, what about fornication? Well, again, I would refer him back to Leviticus 6, where it says, if he finds any lost property or lies about it, or if he swears falsely, or if he commits any such sins that people may do. I assume that it's a general statement there, and I assume that is where fornication would be included. He spoke about God dwelling in the Old Testament as metaphorical. Well, as I've pointed out, God dwelling with his people is a central theme throughout all the prophets. And in one of the quotes I gave you at the beginning there, it actually says that Adam heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the cool of the evening. The idea of God dwelling with his people is of a personal, intimate relationship with God. Now, he was saying that the doctrine of the image of God what does it mean? Does it mean that, I can't remember exactly what you said there, but the bottom line is that the doctrine of the image of God is all the way through the prophets. And so I'd encourage you to seek to understand what it means. But it certainly means that God is able to share his attributes and maintain his unity. It says, be holy as I am holy. He was saying, to whom will you compare God? Well, see, this is the thing, that we are actually meant to live in such a way that we declare the glory of God to this world. You might find that as something to mock, but as Christians, we don't find that something to mock. We see that as we live in holiness, that as we live in truth, that we show what God is like. And that's one of the central things of the image of God. It's certainly something, I wouldn't go mocking it. Now, the reason why we have this different understanding about God is because we have a completely different logic about God. Muslims and Christians both have a logical position, it's just we have a different logic. As I said, the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms and the Gospel teach that God made us in his image. There's a connection between us and God, that he dwells with us. That makes for a certain logic. Islam doesn't have that. That leads to a different logic. And I acknowledge that. They're both logical, they've just got a different basis. What I'm saying is that the logic we should have should come from the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms and the Gospel. I'll finally finish up with Isaiah 49, which he was saying is referring to Israel. Well, if you go to Isaiah 49, verse 6, it says here, and now the Lord says, verse 6, and he says, it is too small a thing for you to be my servant, to restore the tribes of Israel and to bring back those of Israel I have kept. So I will make you a light to the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. And what we see there is that the servant is going to have a ministry to Israel. So it's not just that, you can't just say the servant is Israel, because if you read Isaiah, you actually see that the servant is going to have a ministry to Israel. Israel is the servant, but the servant who is to come will have a ministry to Israel and to the nations of the world. So again, please just read Isaiah in context. Thank you.
Yep, I did read it in context, and if you go back to Isaiah 49:3, that's 3 verses before the quote you just mentioned, it says, God says, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will display my splendour. That's 3 verses before his quote. Israel is called God's servant, and if you look at the text he just said, it said, it is too small a thing for you, my servant, to restore the tribes of Jacob back to Israel, back to yourself, basically. So it's not restore Israel back to Israel, it's restoring the tribes of Jacob back to Israel. Of course Israel should restore the tribes of Jacob back to Israel, yes. So again, just read 3 verses beforehand and you'll get the answer. In terms of, Ibn Masud, seeing the copies of the Quran, between Ibn Masud and Zayd bin Thabit, who is the collector, Ibn Masud thought that he was older than Zayd bin Thabit, and that basically he should have been selected to be the one who compiles the Quran, and that was just more of a personality issue between the two. But never, and this is my challenge, never did he say that the text is corrupt or there's any problems with the text. He says that Ibn Masud was preaching against the text. I've read that. It doesn't. Please quote it verbatim. If Ibn Masud actually says the text of Zayd bin Thabit is actually corrupt or changed or is not something I recognize, you will not find that. In terms of the Sana manuscripts, the non-Uthmanic text, yes, he's actually referring to calligraphy, Hijazi script. Not actually, it's a type of calligraphy. Not referring to the text as something a different kind of text. It is not. Again, you have to do more research on the Sana manuscripts. What about? He quoted that the sacrifice for sins is, and he quoted that text about saying, lying and stealing, any such sins. Well, lying and stealing is not fornication. So that was my point. It's not fornication. Any such sins, not any sins. So again, it doesn't support your point. What is the blood sacrifice to expiate the sin of fornication? You don't have it. As for the issue of the dwelling with God, so God dwelling with man, in Micah 6:8, which is in the Old Testament, it says, God has told you what is good and what God requires of you, only that you act justly, love goodness, and walk humbly with your God. So we have to walk humbly with God. Did the Jews believe that, right, let me find God and I will walk humbly with him? No. It's a very obvious to you. It's a meaning that you must, it's a metaphorical meaning. It's a very flowery meaning, which means that obviously be humble and walk in the path of God. Not literally walk with God. But again, if you want to take certain things in the Old Testament literally, you'll come up with many problems. Something which I didn't mention before, which is the issue of paradise. It goes, look at paradise is very essential. Well, in the Old Testament book of Proverbs, it says, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you might die. That's very essential, and yet the Old Testament, the Torah, is saying, eat, drink, and be merry. This is a very essential thing. God created, food and drink and so on. God created, obviously, spouses and so on. And there is verses referring to women also getting the delights in paradise. So again, if it's just maybe your sensibilities, which you might think, the hereafter is actually it's physical. Well, you're given physical bodies in the hereafter, so you're just going to be like kind of just floating in the air doing nothing. Well, no. If God's rewarding you for something, then obviously it has to be some pleasure in it, because God created both pain and pleasure. So surely He'll reward you with that mechanism. He said there's a problem with the different logics. There is a problem with different logics. They're both logical, but we have different approaches. But the Jews don't agree with that. Logical, so God is unchanging, yet He can change. Nothing can contain God, but a human can contain God. God is undying, yet He can die. That's not logic. Let me give another example. They say the Son has a will. So, not by your will, but not by my will, but your will be done, Jesus says. Okay, and the Father has a will, right? And the Holy Spirit has a will. And Jesus has infinite power, the Christian will say. And the Father has infinite power. And the Holy Spirit has infinite power. And they each have free wills. So each has a will. So that's free wills in total. Each will has infinite power. How is that different from free gods, if you just think about it? Each has a will. Each has infinite power. And they're not under the control of each other. So isn't that not free gods? If you think about it, is that logical? Is that the message of the Torah, that God actually has divisions or separations amongst himself? Did the Jews know anything? Did the Jews even conceive that God has a number attached to in his internal essence? If it was 3, why 3? Why not 4 or 5? At what point in God's eternity did he decide to have 3? And if he did decide, then it had a start point and it's not eternal. You see, it becomes very confusing when you start to play around with the nature of God. And I think we should go back to the Old Testament and Islam and the concept of God, which is pure and has always been consistent. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take questions from the floor now. I'm going to spend... if you could address the questions to me, and I will relay them to the speakers. If you want to come back at the speaker, if you could do so, if you could wait till the speaker has finished addressing the question, and then if we've time you can come back, or if time is moving on, we'll move on to the next question, if that's okay. And I'm going to try and keep it even and do a question, the same number of questions to both speakers. And if you can tell me when you're addressing the question through me who you're asking the question to, we'll spend about 10 minutes on those questions. Sorry, first hand up. Well, you were first hand up.
Speaker for Assembly. I'm just wondering why he said the Bible contains many books of many prophets. Why wasn't the book of Enoch, wasn't included, especially in considering that it predicts the coming of a messenger after Jesus? If you go to page 113, and I have
Okay, so
I'm just going to relay the question back so that everybody can hear the question. The gentleman would like to know why the book of Enoch is not included when it talks about Jesus or the prophet coming back or the afterlife. Messenger coming after Jesus.
Sorry, do you mean the prophet, the book Enoch?
Yeah.
Enoch. Okay, well, I guess I'd want to see, because the Bible is a collection of many books over 1,500 years, Enoch is actually an intertestamental book, and so it hasn't been considered as canon by Jews or Christians. There are many books out there, so there are some books which we haven't accepted as scripture. And so there was the reason in which they chose books or for scripture was that they had continuous use as scripture. They were known to have come from a prophet and to have an early origin. And so these were the criteria that they used. And I would say that with the book of Enoch, it didn't meet that criteria. Now, regarding it predicting a prophet, I wasn't aware that it did that, so it's a bit hard for me to say.
Can I quote?
I guess I'd like to see the book or wherever, because certainly the message of the prophets, which I was showing today, comes to its fulfilment in Christ. And certainly for the Jews, they were expecting that when the Messiah came, that was it. And so it would be it's got to fit into that overall flow of the prophets to be amongst the prophets. I'll leave it there.
Sorry, this gentleman was second. His hand up that I seen. Yep.
Question to Mr. Abdullah. I don't know tonight we will have about Jewish or about Islam, because the message was then what Islam believe on a prophet or not. And I know that in the Quran is a 214th chapter. I come from background of Islam, and I converted to Christianity. 152 chapters are about Muhammad, his wife, jihad, zakat, and so goes on. How many chapters in the Quran is written about the other prophets?
That gentleman would like to know how many other chapters in the Quran are about other prophets?
About the prophets.
About
because
the prophets.
The Bible is then the 66 book. 39 of them is the Old Testament. All is a prophet in one line.
I don't think it's a question of numbers of verses, because you quote a whole bunch of things, like there's laws, they're talking about the Prophet Muhammad and so on. Actually, most of the Quran is talking about the hereafter and God and so on. So there's actually a wide variety of subjects talked about in the Quran, and the majority of it is actually not the laws of Islam. You asked a good question, is why you didn't hear me actually even quote any surahs of Quran or anything today, because I'm here to kind of represent the message of the prophets, which is a consistent message for the prophet. Now, if I could quote the Prophet Muhammad, that's fine. But when I want to affirm the monotheism of God, and that God is not a man or dies or has any of those incidents happen to him, it is the prophets in the Old Testament which agree with Islam, and it is Islam which carries the torch and maintains an exactly same consistent belief. And that's what I'm trying to draw attention to. Islam is nothing alien or says nothing new in this regard when it comes to the concept of God. Whereas what we find with New Testament Christianity, or rather shall I say more the Trinitarian Christianity, because obviously Unitarian Christians are more similar to us than obviously Trinitarians. But we see a very different concept of God being mentioned, and an unheard of, a very alien concept of God outside of Israel. Obviously amongst the Greeks, amongst the pagans, a God that has multiplicity in him is common. They know this. I mean, they have many different belief systems. But Judaism doesn't have that belief, and neither does Islam. And the point today was to show that the Islamic concept of God, which is a one God, which is indivisible, doesn't come down as a human being or die or suffer any of these kind of contradictions, is basically the message of the prophets is the message of Old Testament Judaism and the message of Islam. God that is ineffable, and he creates all things, and he cannot be approached, and he cannot be seen, but he controls and guides all things. So this is basically the message of the prophets, which I'm presenting here today.
Just to say that with the Muslim people, they have to go and read the Old Testament and the New Testament and practicing it, because all of them is accepted by the Islam faith.
The reason why I'm talking about the Old Testament is because this is what we have in common. We believe that in the source of the revelation for the Torah and the Psalms, both Christians and Muslims, we both believe in this. So I thought maybe a meeting place for Islam and Christianity is in the Old Testament. As a common meeting place, because we both agree that God revealed the Torah and the Psalms, and so we can meet there and come to a common agreement. And that is why I'm discussing it here today. This is the reason I bring it up. It's the Islamic message, I believe, as I said, is not an alien message. It's very much a very familiar one, maybe a reiterated one. And I think it's a message that, the Quran describes itself as the reminder, a dhikr, reminder, going back to the original message. And this is why I, who came from a Christian background, I'm now a Muslim. I haven't left Jesus. I rediscovered him and his message.
Yeah, gentleman in the white t-shirt.
This question is I presume in Christianity, God is all powerful, all knowing. So is he all merciful? Because if he's not, if he is, then punishing everyone for an original sin seems to contradict.
This gentleman would like to know, if God is all merciful, why would he punish the original sin?
Okay. That's because there is one humanity, and what Adam did has corrupted us all. On the day of judgment, you won't be condemned for what Adam did, but you share in the corruption that Adam has, that Adam brought to humanity. So we tend to think of ourselves all as individuals, but it's not like that in the Bible. So what Adam did affected all of humanity. This is the way the Torah and the prophets put it forward, that there are individual, in God's ordering of the world, some people are special and they can represent an entire nation, or they can represent an entire humanity, as is the case with Adam. So God will be fair to us, we can be completely fair to us in judgment, but yet we still share in the corruption that Adam brought to humanity. So that's how we see it going. And in fact, it's a very important understanding for realising how Jesus can pay for our sins. It's not that Jesus is just an isolated person from us, but he's like Adam in that we're connected, or we can be united to Jesus. And so the death that he dies can be your death for sin, can be your punishment, because you can be united to him in the same way that we were united to Adam, and what Adam did has affected us. So.
So many questions. Okay, we've had 2 questions for Sam, so we can have, and 1 question for Abdullah. Can we have the next question for Abdullah? And then we'll do 2 more questions finished. So, yeah.
Abdullah, thank you very much. You were quite strong, emphatic in fact, about the Old Testament being a non-diverse monotheism. I'd like to read King David speaking. So King David in Psalm 110 says this. He says, "The Lord," that's Yahweh, "the Lord, Yahweh, says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." My question is simply this: who is David's Lord?
So this gentleman would like to know, who is David's Lord?
Good question. It's an example of grammatical shift. So what we see is it is not David saying, "The Lord said to my Lord." Rather, he's actually referring to himself, and I'll give you an example. So we see in the book of in Psalm 72 exactly the same with Solomon. Yeah, we don't believe that, and that's referring to Solomon, and everyone agrees with that. We also see in David's Song of Praise 2 Samuel 22:51. Therefore I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations. I will sing praises to your name. He gives his king great victories. He shows unfailing kindness to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever. David's saying this, and he's mentioning David in the third person, himself in the third person. Again, this is how Jews read it and so on and so forth. And there's loads of grammatical shifts. In Genesis 4:23, Lamech says, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. It's in himself. And we see David saying, take with you the servants of your Lord. He's actually referring to his servants. He's talking to his servants. Take with you the servants of your Lord, which is himself. And again, I can't pronounce this. Ahasuerus said, in the name of the king. He didn't say it in my name. He's actually referring to himself. So this is what we call grammatical shift, and it's common throughout the Old Testament. So that's what he's referring to. It's not referring to any additional gods. And as I said, if you look at the text, it says, not the Lord said to my Lord. It says Yahweh says to my Adonai. And Adonai is referring to humans. It's referring to King David himself, he's an Adonai, but King David is not Yahweh. So that's the question.
Can I push back?
Yeah, sure.
So thank you for that grammatical shift. My problem with that is that as you go through the Psalm, so in verse 4, the Lord Yahweh says to this king, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now, are we then to assume that David occupied an eternal priestly role, as I think is what is referred by Melchizedek, or are we to look to another?
As I said, in the Old Testament, this is what I talk about the flowery language, there are many times where it refers to, God will establish this king and there should be, it should rule for peace forever and so on and so forth. Not referring to Jesus, actually to what we all agree is actually referring to maybe that particular king. Many, many times throughout the Old Testament. Yet we know that king died after a certain period of time. He didn't live forever. So it's just the language in the Old Testament, and as I said, Jews understand this, that there's a lot of this interesting language, and as I said, in some cases, people are called even God in the Old Testament. So Moses is called an Elohim in the Old Testament. Angels are called Elohim, and so on. And even one case, an angel is called Yahweh. So this is just the flowery, you could say that very metaphorical language in the Old Testament, and as I said, Jews understand this perfectly. But if we take it literally, we start coming up with problems. But as I said, there is many cases of a grammatical shift, and I think, as I said, I can quote you even more verses on grammatical shifts as an example, but that's just an aspect of the Old Testament.
I'm going to have one more question per speaker, and then speakers are going to have a 2-minute summary to finish. So we can have another question for Sam.
I have a question for you. I read somewhere, and I don't want to think exactly when Jesus on the cross, he said, "Oh Lord, why hast thou forsaken me?" Now, our question is that such a practice leads to the inference that this person has practices of fear and doubt. Now, would the practice of God in the Old Testament, would they contain doubt and fear as well? And if they don't, is that all inconsistency between the Old Testament and the New Testament?
This gentleman's question refers to inconsistencies between the Old and New Testament in relation to fear mentioned in the New Testament.
Thank you for that, and that's a great question. It comes from Psalm 22 that Jesus quotes on the cross, and I can share with you the Christian understanding of that, because what we see Jesus saying there is the beginning of the psalm, and as you read through the psalm, you see that the person who at the beginning says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" God then comes, and this person suffers, this person dies, this person is raised. So it's Psalm 22. And then this person praises God. And so what it seems is that this is a psalm about a man who, in his worship and life for God, keeps his faith in God even with the suffering that brings. And so the psalm begins with his honest expression of the difficulty that is, which is what you referred to, but it doesn't end there. And so I guess what I'd want to do is to say we need to read the whole psalm, because when Jesus quotes those words, I think we're meant to have the whole psalm in mind, that this is what he's going through, this is the anguish he has, but he knows and we know where it's going to end from reading the psalm. Thank you.
And the final question for Abdullah.
I was just wondering, Abdullah, Imam in Islam. So you've talked about the Torah loss, and you've said that it's the revelation of God. I was just wondering, does Islam consider that scripture? And if it doesn't consider it scripture, why is it not considered scripture if you believe it to be the revelation of God?
This gentleman would like to know if that's the revelation of God. Why is it not considered scripture?
That's a good question. I was talking about the source or the origin. So something can be a source from a particular author, but then later on the message, I'm not talking about the text, but just the message, which then later on became written down into a narrative text, could have been changed or suffer kind of changes to it. I mean, this happens, especially when you consider that the Old Testament is not some kind of book that came down from the sky and is the literal word of God. You actually have a lot of human beings talking about this. Like you find texts where it says, I believe, where prophets have died, and said, to this day no one knows where he's buried. I mean, like, is that, and it's meant to be attributed to the person, Moses, I believe it is. Moses meant to have written a book where he said that Moses died and he was buried, and no one to this day knows where he's buried. Did Moses write that? You see, so this is the kind of this is what we say now. It's people who've come and to try to kind of write an account of the beliefs of the people in their community. They write an account, and then this account then becomes popular and then becomes used as a reference text, and then maybe at some point in time it becomes holy. This occurred with the New Testament as well. The New Testament. We call it New Testament. It was actually just a collection of Gospels which was selected from a whole number of Gospels. There was preferences. Some were more popular than others. Some were better candidates, and they never made it into the New Testament. So there are basic. I mean, the basic. It's a human text. It's a very human text. With the Quran, we believe it was a revelation from God sent down to Muhammad ﷺ, via Angel Gabriel, and then related and recited by the people. And in this situation, it's not that a Muslim came along 100 years after the Prophet Muhammad and said, you know what, I want to write a narrative of the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Yeah, actually, that did happen, but we don't view that as holy text. It's called seerah literature, seerah, and it's the story of the Prophet Muhammad. We don't view the seerah as a holy book at all. In fact, we actually we view it with some kind of risk that it could be not entirely accurate because the source checking and so on is always an issue. So we're consistent. So we treat the Bible like we also treat our own literature, but narratives about the Prophet Muhammad's life, written by people who came much later. So we are consistent. We treat, Christian scriptures as we treat the equivalent within the Islamic framework. But the Quran is not the same book. And I just want to give you an example. We see in the oldest in old texts when they discover in the Bible. I mean, for hundreds of years they believe, for example, that there are three that bear witness in heaven. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit. In the Jonah Comma they call it, and then they discover an old Bible text that doesn't contain it, and they go, it's not actually part of the original text. Remove it. They discovered that the woman taking adultery in John 7 is not there. They also discovered that the last 12 verses of Mark. Not there. So these are just things. Now these are the changes. Now it's not to kind of say, okay, we should throw the Bible out, but it's just to say that it's not some kind of set in stone thing. It's a human text, and you have to approach it like a historian would approach any text. And likewise, with the narrations of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, which were preserved by humans, we have a whole science of course, science of hadith, whereby we don't say it's sacred and we just accept it. No, it's actually the hadith. A lot of them we accept, but there's a possibility it could be, this could be inaccurate. So we approach it with that level, and it's kind of time to not view the New Testament as a book set in stone or a direct revelation from God, because it's not. And even in the Paul, when he wrote in one of his letters, he said, "I, Paul, say this, not God." Right? So is that actually God's revelation? God's revelation that I, Paul, say it, not God? It would be contradicting himself. So this is what I'm saying, is that these are human texts. I accept that the message that was going around the community was initiated by a revelation, but how humans have treated that message and handled it, is something that we should be very careful about, because humans are humans. So.
Okay, now each speaker is going to come up and finish off with a 2-minute summary, starting with Sam. Listen.
Well, I want to thank you for tonight. Thank you for coming along and listening to both of us. because I think this is a very important issue that we need to sort out. Because as I said, I hope that you have a heart that seeks the things of God and wants to hear from him. And so we need to listen to the message of the prophets, what God has spoken to us. To make a summary of what I said that throughout the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms and the Gospel, we see that God has created us in his image to dwell with him and to share in his glory as sons, and that this comes to its fulfilment through Jesus. And I want to encourage you to read the prophets, to read them. Abdullah and I have been saying different things about what these books say. Well, why don't you go and read them yourself and make up your own mind? Because it is a serious thing to turn people away from the prophets. It's a serious thing to say and to exaggerate by saying the Bible has these variants, when tonight I showed the wholesale burning of the Quran. I showed companions of the Prophet not accepting the Uthman one. I've even got 2 Qurans here with 1,352 differences between them. You can buy these different Arabic Qurans today. So I call on Muslim leaders to stop this exaggerating and turning people away from the prophets. It's a very serious thing. Christians believe all the prophets. We make no distinction between them. We read them all. And the message we preach in the gospel of Jesus is the fulfilment of all the prophets. Thank you very much.
As I said, thank you for all for coming today. It's really been great to be able to share the kind of discussions we have and raise the kind of questions. This is not meant to be the end of the debate, but actually the beginning for you guys to go home and amongst each other speak and debate amongst yourselves what you've heard. I would say that basically, yes, you should read the books for yourself. I call it kind of the isolated room test. Go into a room. Imagine that you can throw all dogma and all preconceptions out the window, and you're just approaching the Bible based on what it actually says and what it is. Will you come to the conclusion that God comes down as a man, he can be killed, he can change, and he basically is a human being, as a man? You wouldn't conclude that based on what the Old Testament has said. And based on the consistency that we believe, that obviously God doesn't refute himself, contradict himself, or is not the author of confusion. I think some more information about the Quran. When the Islamic state spread, it encountered people who were not Arabic speakers, and so they didn't understand the different Arabic dialects, and they got confused. So what happened was Uthman standardized the Quran into one dialect for the non-Arabic speakers to find it easy. And then he ordered the burning of the books. In Islam, burning Qurans is actually the respectful way of getting rid of a Quran. You don't throw it into the bin, you have to burn it or bury it. And that's basically, so that's nothing sinister at all. And the differences in the Quranic text are, it's like me saying that, the American word for colour and the English word for colour are 2 different words, just because they have a different spelling of the word you. That's the kind of difference he's talking about. Again, it's a little disingenuous. But what I will say is that I've tried to preach the consistent message of the Old Testament today, which is that God is one, he's ineffable, he's unapproachable, he is unlimited, he is not finite, he's not a man, he's not the son of man, and he's indeed the God of the Old Testament, the God which I call you today, the God of Jesus, and the God of Islam and the Prophet Muhammad. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank you all for coming, and I'd like to thank both of our speakers for speaking, both of whom spoke with real conviction about what they believed, and I hope that you will all take away and think about what both speakers said, and I'd like to give them a round of applause.